Welcome to the Chess Angle. This is not your typical chess podcast. If you're an amateur or club-level player, the Chess Angle is for you. Our content is aimed at busy adults who are serious about the game but have limited study time. Featured guests include both amateur and titled players alike. And now, here's your host, Director of the Long Island Chess Club, Neil Bellon.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. This is going to be one of those episodes where I react or respond to an article I saw online. This is a type of content I've been adding to the podcast. I enjoy it. I seem to be getting a positive response from many of you, so I'm going to continue to do it. And what I'm going to discuss today is a Reddit post that I saw. Now, for the uninitiated, Reddit is not really social media. It's more of a discussion board type of platform. Some might call it social media, but I don't really consider it that, because when you look at Twitter or X or Facebook and Instagram, there's really a lot of nonsense on there. Reddit, to me, has a little bit more integrity, and within Reddit, there are individual groups called subreddits. There's a subreddit on pretty much any topic you can think of. I'm sure many of you do check out the chess subreddit. I check it out generally once or twice a week to see what's on there. And overall, it's pretty good. Yeah, you have your nonsense comments, I should say, and people who are going to chime in with sort of silly responses. That's any platform. But generally speaking, Reddit is pretty good. Now, it's spelled Reddit for the uninitiated. It's sort of a play on words, like you say, oh, I read it in this magazine, or I read it online, so get it Reddit. That's where it comes from. But again, it's more of a discussion board than your typical social media. And the post that I'm going to look at, it's titled, "What are some of the most advanced and incomprehensible concepts in chess?" Great question. And a number of amateurs chimed in. What's good about the response is it wasn't a bunch of titled players chiming in and sort of speaking about it on terms that maybe only they will understand. It was pretty much just amateurs that chimed in, presumably, which is good. But there was some very interesting responses. So what I'm going to do, I'm not going to read the whole thing from cover to cover. That would be silly, because there are about 151 responses, at least at this time. I will, of course, put a link for it in the show notes so you can check out the original thread. But I cherry-picked certain answers that I thought were the most interesting, and there were definitely some themes throughout this, some common topics that kept coming up over and over again in this thread. The first response I'm going to look at has to do with pawn breaks and pawn play. That was a big response. A lot of players find that confusing, and it is. Pawn structure and pawn breaks and how to use your pawns can be a very confusing topic. But this is what one person replied. He said, "For me, it's pawn breaks. In closed positions, the winning middle game plan is usually to make a particular pawn break work, but if you play it too early or too late or go for the wrong pawn break, then you end up giving your opponent a permanent weakness or a crushing attack. Grandmasters study pawn structure to death, and they still lose games over mistimed pawn breaks, especially with fast time controls. Terrifying." Very well said. And then somebody chimed in right after, "When I push pawns, it's overextending. When they do," meaning GMs, "it's taking space." So, yeah, well, I mean, that's the question. If I push this pawn, is it a good move, or am I overextending and it can be captured? But very, very good response. So let's take it from White's point of view. If you have pawns, say, on D3 and E4 and C2, let's take that in order. Let's say you have pawns on C2, D3, and E4, right? So it's pointing towards your opponent's king side. You want to look for that F4 break, because that's where you already have space. I know I'm oversimplifying this a bit, but the reason that pawn breaks and pawn play is so difficult, it involves a lot of analysis. Because again, there's no backsies with pawn moves. So if I move this pawn forward, am I creating a permanent weakness that he can take advantage of? If we move a piece like a knight or a bishop, and it's like, oops, that wasn't the best idea, as long as it's not a wild, open, tactical position, you can probably just concede you made a mistake and move your piece back, and you will likely be okay. especially if it's a more slower or static position. But with pawn breaks, again, it's no backsies, as the kids say, so you have to be careful. And again, it's a lot of analysis, because if you push a pawn, can he take? Can he not take? Do you take? Do you not take? Can he ignore it and move something else somewhere on the other side of the board because there's a strong tactic there and you didn't even see it and your pawn push doesn't matter, right? There's a lot of things you have to look at and a lot of variations. That's why these pawn breaks are so difficult. And again, that just comes with study and experience. But as this poster said, as this person who responded to the post said, even for GMs, that can be a tricky thing to analyze. So a number of people did chime in that pawn breaks and knowing when to push a pawn and when not to and how to time it, that is very difficult. So that was an interesting response. Now, sticking with the subject of pawns, someone said also the tension between two enemy pawns attacking each other. Very, very good point. So when we say pawn tension, it means your pawn is facing your opponent's pawn diagonally, right? You can take him or he can take you. And of course, that's analysis, because if I take, is that good that I'm opening up a file or bad? Can he open up a file? If I take, was my pawn doing something else? Like, was it defending another piece? Again, there's a lot of analysis there and a lot of what ifs. And that's why these pawn ideas are so tricky. But one thing I will say, most amateurs don't like pawn tension. They want it resolved. In other words, when the two pawns are facing each other diagonally, there's an instinct to kind of want to take immediately just to resolve it. Whereas if you look at games of strong players, opposing pawns, the enemy pawns will face each other for quite some time. Both players will ignore it and do other things. But I find with a lot of amateurs, they just want to take right away. And I've sometimes fallen into that trap myself, where I took or I let my opponent take and I should have done something else. So, even among stronger or experienced players, that's an issue. Very, very interesting. A lot of people chimed in that playing with pawns and using pawns correctly is a very, very difficult concept for them. And all I would say is it does come with time and experience and study and trial and error. But as this person pointed out, even for titled players, it's often an issue. Then people brought up Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual. One person said, when I was reading Dvoretsky, I thought, okay, this is very challenging, but not too crazy, until I got the king, knight, and pawn endings. 4 straight pages of dense notation about how to try and win king, knight, and 3 versus king, knight, and 4. I gave up on the spot, still haven't tried to pick the book back up. Well, Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual, that is very, very advanced. I mean, that book, just my opinion, I've mentioned this book before, that's for people who really have an inordinate amount of time, who are already strong players and are looking to be like titled. That type of thing. I think for your typical amateur, you're better off with something like Pandolfini's Endgame course or Silman's Complete Endgame course. If you get either one of those books, or let's say both of those books, I mean, you'll be set for pretty much your entire career as an amateur player, even if you reach 2000. But these sort of esoteric endings, these like king, knight, and 3 versus king, knight, and 4, I don't know if spending too much time on that is really going to help you at this level. That's more of an advanced thing. So a lot of people chimed in about Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual. There was a lot of frustration with it. So if you check out the post, you can look at those. I won't get into all the responses now. Now, here's an interesting one on endgames and engines. So remember, people are responding to the question, what are some of the most advanced and incomprehensible concepts in chess? So this is what one person wrote. He said, engine moves in the endgame are usually pretty incomprehensible, in my opinion. A good example of this is Game 6 of the 2018 World Chess Championship, where Caruana missed a 30-move forced mating sequence that, even with the entire sequence displayed in front of them, Grandmasters Svidler and Grishuk, who were commentating, couldn't comprehend the logic behind the moves. About the winning sequence, Kasparov said, the computer shows black wins with 68 bishop h4 here, but had Caruana played the incredible bishop d5, knight e2, bishop f3, knight g1 sequence, they would request metal detectors immediately. No human can willingly trap his own knight like that. So basically they're saying even though the computer shows a winning line, for most humans, even super GMs, it's often going to be incomprehensible to actually play it in a tournament. So think about us amateurs. Now, responding to that comment, someone else said, that's the best example I've seen of how computers can distort perceptions of a game. All the top players said clearly that there was no way a human was ever finding that. So very, very interesting. Speaking of endgames, there was a lot of comments on endgames and the difficulty of endgames. So somebody said there are many endgame positions when only one move wins or saves a draw, but it's totally not clear what makes this move different from others. That's very, very true. I've had games where I got lucky, where I had a choice. It was a very tricky king and pawn endgame, and it turns out the move I made was the only one that draws or wins. But I got to tell you, there was a little bit of luck factor with that, because what he just said, it's totally not clear what makes this move different from the others. That's very, very true. That's one of the realities of playing in tournaments. Then someone, their name is Healers Hug Hippos. That's their screen name. I guess I'll mention the screen names once in a while. He wrote 3 different types of endings that he found tricky. So he goes like this. He goes, A, rook and pawn endgames. You can study them all you want, but if Kasparov can lose a 4 versus 3 pawn endgame with rooks, then anyone can. So many rules going this way and that way, and you keep studying them until you don't know if you're playing chess or checkers. Yeah, those rook and pawn endgames are very, very tricky. Now, as far as rook and 3 versus rook and 4, those rook and pawn endgames where your opponent or you has 1 extra pawn, the general rule is, and this is incredible oversimplifying here, if one player has a 1 pawn advantage in a rook and pawn ending, the general rule is that if the pawns are on the same side of the board, that it's probably drawn. But if that extra pawn is on the other side of the board, maybe it's passed, that kind of changes things a bit. But that's, again, a gross generalization. But rook and pawn endgames are notoriously tricky, even for GMs. Very, very difficult. Then he says B, queen and king versus rook and king. Ooh, that's a good one. So queen and king versus rook and king, while objectively a win for the side with a queen, if the side with a rook knows what they're doing, it can be torture to convert. Yeah, I agree with him there. And he continues to say, recently Nepo couldn't convert this endgame against Carlsen because Magnus threw every trick and trap and managed to prolong it to a 50-move draw, right? And of course, the 50-move rule, for those of you who don't know, if 50 moves are played without a pawn move or a capture, you can claim a draw. And then his third example of a difficult endgame, he says the Najdorf Sicilian, I guess this is more opening, So he says the Najdorf Sicilian, assuming you get to play a6 and enter the Najdorf, there's 12 possible moves white could play, and all of them have books worth of theory of how to play them, and all are viable for an advantage. Now, as I've said before, I mean, he's right there. The Najdorf Sicilian, that is one of the most difficult and theoretically demanding openings, even for super GMs. So I do feel that as an amateur player, you might want to stay away from it, but I know a lot of you play it and enjoy it. So, do what you got to do. I wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole, but I'm not an E4 player anyway, so I'm probably not qualified to talk about it. The Najdorf, of course, a very, very difficult opening. Now, someone else mentioned the king and rook versus king and queen ending, but they put a little twist to it. This is what he said. He goes, one of my better chess achievements was managing to hold king and rook versus king and queen against our club's best player, though it was less to do with the side with the rook knowing what they were doing and more the side with the queen having bad time trouble. And that's an interesting commentary on how the clock is so much a part of the game. So that's an example of king and rook and king and queen in the context of the realities of OTB tournament play. This next comment I really, really like. It's about playing h4. And he says it's sort of a meme at top level chess that in any position where it's legal, h4 is a viable candidate move. And the explanation for why is basically a vague justification that according to engines, at some point down the line, if you're going to provoke a weakness that you can then exploit. So yeah, the idea of H4, that's an AlphaZero thing, AlphaZero, like the supercomputer, where it justifies H4 as a viable move. And, it attacks your opponent's king, assuming he's castled. I just think it's funny that he's saying, I mean, it's partly in jest, but there's some truth to it where if you can play H4, very often it's correct. And again, AlphaZero has justified the whole H4 thing. So that's an interesting comment. This next one is one of my favorites in the whole post. It's about compensation. He writes, "For me, it's the entire notion of compensation. There are so many times when I review a high-level game and see a pawn left hanging, and it's a challenge to understand what compensation there is if the pawn is taken. Sometimes it's obvious, but sometimes it can be very subtle or concrete, and it takes a deep understanding of the position to determine why." So very, very true. That's one of the reasons why I've said that very often amateur games are more instructive than grandmaster games, because the concepts and the high-level thinking is so esoteric and hard to apply to your own games. But what he just said, very, very good point. And then as a response to that, somebody said, when GMs don't defend pawns, it's because taking it will give them compensation. But when I do it, it's blundering a pawn. So a little comic relief. But that is an advanced concept for sure, knowing when to take a pawn or not take a pawn or sack a pawn, and correctly judging when you have compensation and when you don't. All right, the next comment is back to openings. Remember, people are posting in response to the question, what are some of the most advanced and incomprehensible concepts in chess? And Super King Dra says move orders in the Italian, right? The Giuoco piano, the quiet game. He says somehow everything transposes or looks like it transposes, but there's some subtle difference. Does white go A4 or bishop B3? Did black play A6 or A5? When is bishop G5 annoying for black, and when is it a bad move? Is H3 and or H6 necessary? Don't even get me started on the double pawn break, where E4 plus D4 versus black E5 plus D5. How is it basically symmetrical, but white is still slightly better? Well, I'm not going to get into that. Very interesting comment about the difficulty of opening theory, but his statement there, that's why I'm not an E4 player, because I just avoid all that theory. But very interesting comment about move orders. The next comment is from Sagittarius ACK, and he says, the most difficult concept in chess is perhaps piece coordination. Piece coordination refers to how to place and maneuver two or more pieces in order to maximize their combined effectiveness. A typical example of piece coordination is doubling the rooks on an open line. A successful king attack is almost always the result of a careful and effective coordination of pieces. In general, even giving mate requires a careful coordination of at least two pieces. The reason why piece coordination is so difficult is simply because in general, there is a very large number of ways in which you can place your pieces on the board. Engines are very good at coordinating pieces. When I play a chess engine, I often end up in a lost position because the engine managed to coordinate 2 to 3 pieces targeting one of my weak pawns or pieces. Very well said. Piece coordination is huge. And that last sentence, I mean, of course, a computer is going to do it well, but finding your opponent's weaknesses and piling on them, that's really a major basis of positional chess, is understanding the weaknesses in your opponent's position and exploiting them while fixing your weaknesses and defending against them and stopping counterplay. But the idea of piece coordination, very true, very difficult concept, very advanced, takes a lot of time. I thought that was a very, very good response. The next comment, this is a bit of a chess psychology sort of mindset type of thing. And here's what he says. For me, a concept that is still clicking, but has improved my chess understanding tremendously is, quote, at any given time, you play the position, not your opponent, and not the game. Of course, sounds stupid when you just say it like this, but I have always struggled against my own tunnel vision and biases based on previously made moves or my opponent's style. No matter if you're in the middle of a trade chain, or you're reacting to a pawn storm, or an attack on your king, or there is tension that is being kept, You always should play the best move in that position, not react to what happened, and see the board as a whole and dissect it to understand the nature of the position. This also applies to calculation, and that is where I understood how hard it is to calculate non-forcing lines and bring the understanding of the position deeper into variations where opponents have several options. For me, understanding how much I lack in the general overview deeper into calculation made me understand how hard it is to move to the level of titled players. So very, very interesting comment. Now, there's an old saying that tactical positions are where you make a move where you know what to do, and more positional strategic positions are the types of positions where you don't know what to do. So yes, sometimes those quiet positions, those very strategic, static, quiet positions, those are often more difficult because if you have an attack or a tactical thing, it's kind of clear what your plan is because usually it involves a set of forced moves or some type of sequence that you're seeing that will win a piece or a pawn or mate. But in those more positional types of games, it's often hard to find a correct plan. And the next series of comments were sort of these quick one-liners, but I think they're important points. So again, people are responding to what are some of the most advanced and incomprehensible concepts. One person wrote sacrifices for long-term positional gains. Very, very good comment. That's definitely an advanced concept, when to sacrifice for a positional gain. And one of the things you need to start doing for that, start by studying the most basic positional sacrifice ideas. For example, when you sacrifice your rook for your opponent's knight in front of his castled king. For example, as white, if you have a rook, say on f3, and you go rook takes f6, you take his knight. And the reason you sacrifice there is because you're messing up his pawn structure, you're opening up lines to his king, and it could lead to an attack. But you can only do that if the position calls for it. That's just a very, very basic textbook example. Now, when he says sacrifices for long-term positional gains, yeah, that's very, very difficult because the problem is when you sacrifice in that instance, you have to really, really know what you're doing because the problem is every follow-up, every move after the sack has to be correct. Otherwise, you're just down material for no reason. And the beef that I have with some title players is they talk about sacrificing for long-term positional gains, but what they don't tell you is that once you do the sacrifice, you have to play incredibly accurately from that point on because you want to get your investment back. You want to prove that that sacrifice was correct. And in that case, sacrificing for long-term positional gains, that's what I call a true sacrifice because the end result is not quite clear. A combinational sacrifice is where you sacrifice and you clearly see the line to the end. Like if I sack my rook here, I'm going to mate him. If I sack my rook here, I'm going to end up winning 2 pawns when it comes out in the wash, that type of thing. But a true sacrifice means you're kind of going on instinct and your positional knowledge. You're going by your gut, basically. Now, the whole idea of going by your gut, that's very hard for us at the amateur level to do, whereas GMs can do it in their sleep. Very, very different. But yeah, sacrificing for long-term gains where you don't see the line clearly to the end, that is absolutely very, very difficult. The next comment, very simple. He goes, when to fianchetto. That's a great one. Knowing when to fianchetto your bishop on the diagonal. Now, usually when you fianchetto, it's helping control a square that another piece might control already. That type of thing. You might fianchetto because it's the best place to develop the bishop. Another fianchetto idea is that if your opponent fianchettoed his bishop, often the best defense is to fianchetto your bishop on that diagonal as well, right? That's an old textbook thing, right? If your opponent fianchettos, you want to fianchetto as well. You just got to be careful you don't fall into some tactics, right? Because when you move that G pawn or B pawn, whatever side you're on, you have to make sure that your rook can't be taken, right? Because you're opening up the diagonal to your rook. So you got to be careful how you do it. But very often, again, when your opponent fianchettos his bishop, the best response is to fianchetto your own bishop on that same diagonal. That's very, very common. Of course, it's position dependent, but just some ideas there. The next comment, this was a big one. A lot of people chimed in on this, is en passant. So someone wrote en passant gets me every time. So en passant is French for in passing. I'm assuming most of you know what it is. Basically, if your opponent moves his pawn 2 squares, so obviously it's on its original square. If he moves his pawn 2 squares and your pawn is adjacent to it, you can capture the pawn in front of it on that same file. All right, that's the en passant move. A lot of beginners don't know about it, or what happens also, even with advanced players, if that's part of a sequence that they're analyzing and calculating, they'll sometimes forget that's an option. Like maybe on move 3 of the sequence, your opponent can capture en passant, but they fail to calculate it. So even among experienced players, that can be an issue. Now, we had a situation at the club, I'm pretty sure I mentioned this on a previous episode, where he didn't know about en passant. His opponent captured en passant, and the other player didn't know about it. He thought he was like making this up. He thought it was illegal, and I had to get involved and convince him that it is a move. It was really, really kind of strange, but it does happen where you'll get beginners or beginning tournament players who never experienced en passant. They don't know what it is. And then when they see it for the first time, they're like, what? That's something that a number of people mentioned here. Very interesting. The next comment has to do with chess books. This is one of my favorite comments in the whole thread. He says, a lot of chess books just give you variations and ends with something like plus minus, which means white has advantage, or minus plus, black has the advantage. And the book never tells you why it has the advantage. They assume you would find it obvious by yourself. I agree completely. You need books as a developing player, that is, you need books with lots of explanatory prose. The books with just variations and very little explanation, that comes later. That's more if you're looking for just kind of a game database. But if a chess book is being labeled as quote unquote an instructional chess book, but there's not a lot of written prose, I would not get that book. All right, so I agree with this post completely. You need a book that has more than just variations, because if you don't understand why the moves are being played, it's pretty much useless to you. So then going back to pawns, we'll make a little bit of a right turn. I like what this person wrote. Should I push this pawn? At pretty much every stage of the game. That's true. I mean, we all go through that. Do I push? Do I not push? And then when you push the pawn and it's correct, you're like, yeah, awesome. And then when you push the pawn and it's not correct, you're like, oh, why did I do that? Yeah, that's a struggle. So again, there were a lot of comments on pawn play. So that is something that many players find difficult. The next response has to do with positional ideas. And he writes, quiet moves and when to make them. Usually it's when you have some massive advantage and the quiet move completely solidifies it. However, if you played enough chess, you will have no doubt one move squandered some massive advantage, and thus it's a very non-intuitive thing to do. You have a massive attack, so you want to keep pressing, but the quiet move gives you the biggest advantage of all. But simultaneously, if you do play a quiet move, sometimes it can squander much of your advantage or completely. There was a UFC fight between John Jones and Daniel Cormier, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, who are two of the best to ever do it. At one point, Jones had Cormier rocked, and instead of rushing in, throwing wild haymakers at the wobbly Cormier, he kicked his ankle, making his legs give out and leading Cormier falling over, and then Jones easily finishing him. There's been many times someone has rushed in the UFC and gotten clipped themselves or taken down. What Jones did was totally intuitive because it doesn't immediately finish the fight, yet it did it in its own way, kind of like a quiet move in chess. So interesting analogy between sports and chess there, but the idea of quiet moves and when to play them, that can be very, very tricky. Like I've spoken about waiting moves in the past. You really have to pick your spots, because if you play a waiting move or a quiet move in the wrong spot, you're going to get yourself into trouble. So I thought that was a really nice comment. The next one is on Zugzwang. As many of you know, but I'll go through it. Zugzwang is basically the compulsion to move, where you're forced to make a move that's losing because you have no choice. You have no other move that you can make. And he says, Zugzwang, it's powerful enough that it can straight up win you the game from an otherwise drawn or lost position, but if you are just one tempo off, you can lose horribly. Truly understanding scenarios in which your opponent has no moves and is forced to worsen their position requires so much experience and such a high-level comprehension of chess to pull off in an actual game. Yeah, Zugzwang can be very, very tricky because there's a lot of factors at play, so I agree with you there, But the whole idea is that you get a position where you force your opponent to make a losing move. But it's definitely an advanced concept in many positions. The next comment is by Reiterman Yes, and his response to the question of some of the most advanced and incomprehensible chess concepts is prophylaxis versus initiative. Understanding the opponent's plan sometimes is hard by itself, but doing so and figuring out the most optimal and useful way to do so is quite difficult. Karpov versus Yusupov and Karpov versus Spassky are both wonderful examples. So is Naidorf's b5 move against Taimanov in that famous King's Indian game. But combining prophylaxis with timing and knowing when the position doesn't allow for it at all, or how to suddenly switch from defensive play to taking the initiative, is a skill only extremely good players truly have. Absolutely. Switching from defensive play to offensive play, knowing when to make a quiet move or when not to, and knowing when to change gears, definitely an advanced concept. The next comment has to do with tactics. He says interference tactics can be insanely difficult. Just check out this crazy move knight d7 from Ivanchuk, and he has a link. He continues, personally, I struggle with building attacks. Good young players will play a move like queen h5 with white, and it doesn't threaten or attack anything, and 5 moves later I'm getting mated. I rarely know what to do other than move pieces towards the enemy king and hope something good happens. Well, a couple of things there. Let me work backwards. Yeah, those queen h5 moves, what often happens is, this happens with online games a lot, they'll move their queen in the vicinity of your king, but here's why you end up losing. You end up making an unnecessary defensive move when you should just ignore it and do something else. So he goes queen h5, he goes near your king, he says boo, and basically you feel the need to like cover, square, defend it, but often that quote-unquote defensive move you're making is unnecessary and weakening, where you're better off playing in the center or somewhere else on the board. Now, obviously, if he's threatening mate, you got to deal with it, but very often he's just moving his queen there just to scare you, and then it forces you to make a weakening defensive move. So that might be why you're losing there. And then what you say, move pieces towards the enemy king and hope something good happens, you got to be careful with that. Now, if you're playing a 5-minute or 3-minute blitz game online, that might be a good strategy because in speed chess, those sort of tactics and scare tactics work. But in a true game, in positional chess, the idea of just moving your pieces towards the king and hoping something good happens, you're going to get yourself in trouble. You have to play what the position calls for. You only want to attack the king if the position calls for it. Now, technically, even in speed games online, you got to be careful with that philosophy. Because I know when I play those controls, I still kind of play my regular positional game, unless, of course, a tactic opens up. But in your classical OTB games, you want to be very careful about simply attacking just because you feel like it. You have to attack when the position calls for it. Now, I really like the first paragraph about interference tactics being difficult. Now, an interference tactic, this is a tricky one to explain without visually having a board. But basically, an example, let's say your opponent has a piece that's defending another one of his pieces. You sort of insert one of your own pieces, and it's creating a threat of your own. It's sort of like this insertion move. You can look up interference tactics online if you're not sure what it is. But I agree, those are very, very difficult. But the thing is, if you can find it, they're often winning because it generally creates 2 threats that can't be stopped. So very, very good point. And now I'm going to end with this, our final comment from this great post. What are some of the most advanced and incomprehensible concepts in chess? How does the horsey move? Little comic relief there. How does the horsey move? Yeah, that's a tricky one. It's an L, buddy. It's an L. Like could be a forward L or a sideways L. And the horsey can jump over other pieces. So yes, how does the horsey move? Okay. Very, very good. So I thought that was a fun article. It was a great read. I thought some of the comments were very, very insightful. I will, of course, link it up in the show notes if you want to read the full response, because obviously I didn't read everything. Again, Reddit is, I think, one of those better online platforms as far as discussion. I think it has a lot more integrity than Facebook, Twitter, and some of these other things. But I certainly enjoyed that. Hope you did too. As always, we really appreciate you listening, and I hope you win your next game. Have a great day, everybody.